The night shift at Whitmore Tower was always quiet. By the time the last light in the executive offices dimmed and the hum of business activity slowed to silence, the vast skyscraper stood like a monument in the heart of the city, glittering but empty. For most, the building's pulse ended at 5 o'clock. But for Harold Davis, a 61-year-old janitor with tired knees and a strong back, the real work began long after others had gone home. Harold had been working at Whitmore Tower for nearly 20 years. He knew every hallway, every boardroom, every hidden stairwell that the executives never saw. To them, the building was a symbol of wealth and ambition. To Harold, it was a place where he fought for dignity, where his labor turned invisible in the daylight, yet kept the empire spotless through the night. People rarely looked twice at the janitor, except to nod politely or to pass him by as though he were just another piece of furniture. But Harold saw everything. He saw the way executives whispered nervously in elevators after bad stock reports. He saw interns weeping in corners after being scolded. He noticed when employees left their desks with shaking hands or forced smiles. Years of being invisible had made him a master observer, and that skill, unnoticed by everyone, was about to change everything. It started on a Monday evening in late October. The city was cooling down, the sharpness of autumn in the air. Harold pushed his cart into the executive wing, humming softly to himself, when he noticed something unusual. Inside the corner office, still lit long after hours, sat Charles Whitmore himself, the CEO, the man whose name shone in gold letters at the top of the building. Whitmore was a man of presence. In his early 60s, he carried himself with a mix of authority and charm, the kind of figure who dominated boardrooms and inspired investors. His suits were tailored, his shoes polished, his voice steady. To most, he was untouchable, an image of power. But on that night, Harold saw something that made him pause. Whitmore was slumped slightly in his chair, rubbing his chest with an absent-minded expression. His face was pale, his lips almost dry. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water. Harold froze, watching quietly from the doorway. He had seen that look before. Years ago, Harold's younger brother, Martin, had suffered a heart attack at only 45. Harold had been there. The night Martin complained of chest tightness and fatigue. The night the family thought it was just stress or indigestion. They had ignored the warning signs until Martin collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. The memory haunted Harold. So when he saw the same struggle in Whitmore's eyes, the shallow breath, the subtle clutching at the chest, he knew something was wrong. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore," Harold said softly, stepping inside. The CEO glanced up, startled. Few people interrupted him in his private space, let alone the janitor. "Yes, what is it?" His voice carried the sharpness of someone used to authority, but also a fatigue that betrayed his condition. I don't mean to overstep," Harold said carefully. He knew his place in this world, and it was not inside this office giving medical advice, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent. "You don't look well, sir. Are you feeling all right?" Whitmore frowned, almost dismissive. "I'm fine, just tired. Long day." He waved a hand as if brushing off the concern. "Don't worry about me. Carry on." Harold hesitated. He wanted to leave it at that. He had learned, over a lifetime, that speaking up could carry consequences. Black men in America had too often been punished for appearing too bold, too forward, too intrusive in spaces where they were expected to stay silent. But something inside him refused to walk away. "Sir," Harold said gently but firmly, "if you don't mind me saying, I've seen those signs before. My brother had them. He ignored them until it was too late. You might want to get checked." Whitmore blinked, surprised. The words hung in the air. For a moment, the CEO seemed caught between irritation and something else. Fear. He studied Harold, perhaps for the first time not as just a janitor, but as a man speaking truth from lived experience. Whitmore muttered. He touched his chest again, almost unconsciously. "It's probably just indigestion. Had a heavy lunch," but his voice trailed off. That night, Whitmore left earlier than usual. He called his driver, went home, and, against his instincts, scheduled a doctor's appointment the next morning. The physician's face turned serious within minutes of the examination. Tests were run. Results confirmed it. He was on the verge of a massive heart attack. Without immediate intervention, his chances of survival were slim. Whitmore's surgery was scheduled the same week, and as he lay in the hospital bed, recovering from what could have been his final day, The name of the man who saved him kept echoing in his mind. Harold Davis. But in the days that followed, something began to trouble Whitmore deeply. He realized that if Harold hadn't spoken, no one would have. Executives who worked with him daily hadn't noticed. Assistants who handed him papers all day hadn't cared enough to look closely. The people surrounding him had been blind. It was the janitor, overlooked, ignored, unseen, who had saved his life. Whitmore began to ask questions about Harold. Who was he? What was his story? And why had it taken nearly losing everything for him to finally see the man who had always been there? For Harold, the event passed quietly. He didn't boast or expect recognition. He returned to his night shift, pushing his cart, scrubbing floors, emptying trash bins. He carried himself with quiet dignity, as he always had. But inside, he felt something shift. He had done what mattered. He had honored his brother's memory, and though the world might not notice, he knew the value of what he had done. What Harold didn't realize was that this act, the simple, human act of caring enough to speak, was about to change not only Whitmore's life, but his own. Whitmore came back to the tower 3 weeks later, thinner, slower, but alive. The building buzzed with whispered rumors of the CEO's health, but no one knew the full truth. Whitmore called a private meeting with his senior team. He spoke about gratitude, about second chances, about the importance of seeing the unseen. He didn't mention Harold by name, at least not yet, but he had a plan. That evening, Whitmore waited until the building emptied. He stayed behind in his office until Harold arrived for his shift. When Harold stepped in, cart rattling, mop in hand, he froze at the sight of the CEO standing in the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore?" Harold asked cautiously. Whitmore smiled faintly. "Harold Davis, I owe you my life." Harold's brow furrowed. "I only spoke up, sir. Anyone would have." "No," Whitmore said firmly. "Not anyone. You saw what no one else did. You cared when no one else bothered. That kind of courage. It matters." For the first time in 2 decades, Harold was invited to sit, not outside an office, not standing with his cart, but inside the CEO's own chair across from him. Whitmore asked about his life, his family, his struggles, and Harold, hesitant at first, began to share. He spoke of growing up in a small southern town, where his father worked 3 jobs to put food on the table. He spoke of segregation, of walking to school while buses carrying white children sped past. He spoke of losing his brother to a preventable heart attack. He spoke of the pride he carried in doing honest work, even when the world treated him as if he were invisible. Whitmore listened, truly listened, and in that moment, something began to shift in him too. That night was only the beginning of a story that would shake the very walls of Whitmore Tower. Because once dignity is seen, once truth is spoken, nothing can stay the same. In the weeks that followed, Harold Davis noticed a change. It was subtle at first. Executives who once passed him in the hall without acknowledgement now nodded or muttered greetings. Assistants smiled a little more warmly, and Whitmore himself, once distant, almost mythic in his authority, now made it a point to greet Harold by name whenever their paths crossed. But Harold wasn't fooled. He had lived long enough to know that respect, offered in the wake of an event, can vanish as quickly as it arrives. Still, he carried himself the same way he always had, with quiet dignity, doing his work with care, refusing to let bitterness settle in his heart.
What Harold didn't know was that Whitmore had begun to wrestle with something far deeper than gratitude. Lying in that hospital bed had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. He had built an empire, yes. He had accumulated wealth, prestige, and influence, but for all his power, he had failed to see the people right in front of him. The men and women who scrubbed his floors, polished his windows, brewed his coffee, kept his world turning. He had walked past them as though they were invisible. And it wasn't just blindness, it was privilege. It was a system so deeply ingrained that men like Harold became shadows in their own workplaces. For Whitmore, this realization was not just humbling, it was unsettling. One evening, Whitmore invited Harold to his office again. The room was quiet, the city skyline glowing beyond the glass. Harold entered cautiously, as though unsure if he was allowed to take up space in such an office twice. "Harold," Whitmore began, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened." Harold nodded, his hands folded in front of him. "I'm just glad you're all right, sir." "It's more than that," Whitmore said. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I realized something in that hospital. All my life I've been surrounded by people who tell me what I want want to hear. People who admire, obey, or compete, but you, someone who had no reason to speak, chose to say the truth. You saved my life, and I've been asking myself, what does that mean for me, for this company, for all the people like you who've been here, unseen? Harold shifted uncomfortably. He was not used to these conversations, not used to being placed in the spotlight. I just did what I thought was right, nothing more. But that's exactly it, Whitmore pressed. Doing what's right when it's not expected, that is everything. He paused, studying Harold. Tell me something, Harold. Have you ever wanted more than this job? The question struck Harold deeply. Of course, he had wanted more. He had dreamed once of becoming a teacher, of mentoring young men in his community, guiding them the way his own father had guided him. But life had been heavy, bills piled up, opportunities were scarce, and the color of his skin, in the America he knew, had closed more doors than it opened. He gave a small smile, the kind that hides pain. Dreams are for young men, Mr. Whitmore. I do my work, and I'm grateful for it. Whitmore sat back, unsatisfied with the answer. He could see the truth in Harold's eyes, the sacrifices, the resignation, and in that moment Whitmore made a decision. The following week, Whitmore Tower held its quarterly all-staff meeting. These gatherings were typically grand affairs, full of glossy presentations and polished speeches. But this time, as employees filled the auditorium, there was a different energy when Whitmore stepped onto the stage. Still thinner from his surgery, but radiating a new kind of gravity. The room quieted. He began by addressing the obvious: his health scare, the surgery, the gratitude he felt for a second chance. But then his tone shifted. There's something else I need to say, Whitmore continued, his voice steady. In this building, in this company, we talk a lot about vision, about leadership, about success. But I've realized something. True, vision isn't just about the next deal or the next market. It's about people. It's about seeing the ones we overlook, the ones who make this place possible every single day. He paused, letting his words sink in. The audience exchanged puzzled looks. 3 weeks ago, Whitmore said, someone saved my life. Not a doctor, not an executive, not one of the people you'd expect. It was a man who has been here longer than most of us. A man who works while we sleep, who keeps this building alive in ways we rarely acknowledge. That man saw what no one else saw. He cared enough to speak when no one else did. His name is Harold Davis. The room fell silent. Heads turned toward the back, where Harold sat in his janitor's uniform, stunned. Whitmore gestured toward him. Stand up, Harold. Slowly, reluctantly, Harold rose to his feet. His heart pounded. Never in his 20 years at Whitmore Tower had he been the center of attention. Now hundreds of eyes were on him. This man, Whitmore said firmly, is the reason I am alive today. And I want everyone in this company to know that his courage, his humanity, his willingness to see what others ignored, those are the values we should all aspire to. Harold Davis is not invisible. He is essential. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. Harold stood frozen, humbled, unsure of how to react. But inside, a warmth spread through him, a validation he had never known in this place. That day marked a turning point. Whitmore announced the creation of a new initiative within the company, programs focused on equity, recognition, and opportunity for workers at every level. He spoke of scholarships for the children of custodial staff, mentorship programs for those who wanted to pursue new paths, healthcare coverage that reached beyond the executives. It was bold, unexpected, and it all began with Harold. But beyond the policies, something more personal happened. Harold began to notice that people looked at him differently, not just as a janitor, but as a man of wisdom, a man with a story worth hearing. Young employees approached him to ask about life, about resilience, about how he carried himself with such grace. And Harold, who had once tucked his dreams away in silence, found himself speaking again. He began to share, to teach, to guide. One evening, as Harold prepared to leave the building, Whitmore stopped him. You once said dreams are for young men, Whitmore reminded him. But I don't believe that. You still have a dream, Harold. What is it? Harold hesitated, then smiled faintly. I always wanted to teach, to help young folks find their way, keep them from making the mistakes we made. Whitmore nodded. Then let's make that happen. Image 4. Months later, with Whitmore's support, Harold launched a mentorship program in his community. It began small, just a few young men from the neighborhood gathering in a church basement, listening to Harold share stories of hard work, dignity, and courage. But it grew. Word spread. Soon the program became a beacon for youth who needed guidance, a safe place where dreams were not just for the privileged, but for anyone willing to chase them. Through it all, Harold never saw himself as a hero, remained the same humble man, pushing his cart through Whitmore Tower, nodding to those he passed, but he carried himself with a new lightness, a sense of fulfillment. He had spoken up when it mattered. He had honored his brother's memory, and he had shown the world that dignity, no matter how overlooked, has the power to save lives. As for Whitmore, he never forgot the lesson. The millionaire CEO who once saw only profit now understood something far greater. Success is hollow. If it blinds you to the humanity around you, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the building emptied and silence filled the halls, he often thought of the man who had taught him that truth. In the end, the story of Harold Davis was not just about saving a life. It was about reclaiming visibility in a world that tried to erase him. It was about courage born from pain, and about the extraordinary power of ordinary people. And so, in a city where skyscrapers gleamed and wealth drew the spotlight, there stood one man whose strength had nothing to do with money or power, everything to do with heart. The black janitor who had seen what everyone ignored, and in doing so, saved not only a life, but a conscience.